At 37, I stood in a marble bank lobby with shaking hands and less than $50 in my wallet, listening to a sentence that erased my entire childhood in one breath. "You were never mentioned in the will," my uncle said calmly, like he was correcting a typo. "Never mentioned." This was the same grandfather who used to press quarters into my palm and whisper, "Save it. One day you'll need it." The man who wrote my name on birthday cards even when my handwriting was still crooked. And now I was being told I didn't exist, at least not on paper. 3 days later, a letter arrived from the bank. An audit notice. A forgotten safe deposit box, my grandfather's name. And mine listed as secondary holder. The fee to open it was $25.70 a year. 35 years unpaid. About $900. Money I didn't have. What was inside that box didn't just change my future. It exposed a $690 million lie and the man who built it. My Uncle Richard chose the smallest conference room at the law office, the one with no windows. I remember thinking it felt intentional, like he didn't want daylight anywhere near what he was about to say. He sat across from me with his hands folded, expensive watch catching the overhead light every time he moved. Calm, polished, patient in the way people are when they believe they've already won. "You were never mentioned in the will," he said. "Not I'm sorry. Not this must be hard. Just a statement. Clean, final." I blinked, waiting for the rest of the sentence. Surely there was more. A footnote. An explanation. Something that would make it make sense. But Richard leaned back in his chair, already done. I stared at the papers spread out on the table. Legal language. Paragraphs I didn't understand. My grandfather's name typed again and again, as if repetition could replace his voice. "That can't be right," I said quietly. "I mean, I know I was young when Grandpa died, but—" Richard sighed. Not in anger, in inconvenience. "Chloe, you were too," he said. "You don't really remember him. You remember stories people told you." The words stung more than I expected, as if memory only counted if it was long enough. As if love had a minimum age requirement. "I remember enough," I said. "I remember him holding me. I remember—" "Emotion," Richard interrupted gently. "You're confusing emotion with facts." He slid the will toward me, tapping the last page with one finger. "This document was drafted, signed, and witnessed properly. The company, the properties, the investments, they were all left to me. There are no other beneficiaries." I looked at the signature at the bottom. It was shaky, smaller than the one I'd seen on old birthday cards my mom kept in a shoebox. "Grandpa was sick," I said. "He was on medication." Richard's jaw tightened, just for a moment. "He was lucid," he replied, "and very clear about his wishes." Clear. I felt heat rise in my chest. "So that's it? I just don't matter?" "That's not what I said," he replied smoothly. "This isn't personal, it's legal." Legal. The word landed heavy. I thought of my mom crying at the kitchen table when the funeral bills came in, of how Richard had promised to take care of everything, of how the company my grandfather built with his own hands somehow slipped entirely into one person's control. "And what about my mother?" I asked. "His daughter?" Richard avoided my eyes this time. "She wasn't mentioned either." The silence that followed felt thick, suffocating. He closed the folder, signaling the end of the conversation. "I know this is disappointing, Chloe, but dragging this out won't help anyone." I stood up slowly, my legs unsteady. "You're sure there's nothing else?" I asked. "No accounts, no letters, no—" "No," he said firmly. "There's nothing." As I walked out of the room, I realized something that made my stomach drop. Richard wasn't just confident, he was relieved. And for the first time, a quiet, terrifying thought formed in my mind. If he was lying, then he had been lying for a very long time. 3 months before that meeting, I still believed my life was uncomfortable but stable. I had a job coordinating operations for a mid-sized logistics firm. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills. I told myself that was enough. Then one Friday afternoon, my manager called me into a glass-walled office and smiled the kind of smile people practice in HR training videos. "Restructuring," he said. Nothing personal. By Monday, my work email was deactivated. By the end of the week, so was my health insurance. At 37, I learned how fast stability can disappear. I burned through my savings faster than I want to admit. Rent came first, groceries second. Everything else became optional. I sold my car because the payments were too much. Then the laptop I'd bought for work. Then a necklace my mom gave me years ago, the one thing I swore I'd never pawn. Each sale felt temporary, just until I got back on my feet. But the calls didn't come. Interviews blurred together. You're overqualified. We're going in a different direction. We'll keep your resume on file. By the time I walked out of my uncle's lawyer's office, my checking account was down to double digits. I stood on the sidewalk afterward, the city rushing past me, and realized I had nowhere to go except home to the tiny studio apartment I could barely afford anymore. That night, I cried harder than I had at the funeral years ago. Not because of the money, because being broke was one thing. Being told you never mattered? That was something else entirely. 3 days later, the bank letter arrived. It was wedged between a past-due electricity notice and a flyer advertising fast cash loans, no credit required. I almost tossed it without opening it. I was tired of envelopes, tired of bad news. But the return address caught my eye. Harrison and Cole National Bank. I sat down on the floor and tore it open. The words safe deposit box audit didn't mean much at first. Then I saw the name. Walter Harris. My grandfather. My heart started pounding so hard I had to read the letter twice. According to their records, a safe deposit box opened 35 years ago had gone untouched. Fees had accumulated. Payment was required to prevent the contents from being surrendered as abandoned property. At the bottom, in smaller print, was a line that made my breath catch. Secondary holder, Chloe Harris. I stared at my name until the letters blurred. Richard had looked me in the eye and said there was nothing. No accounts. No letters. No anything. And yet here it was. A box no one had mentioned. A box with my name on it. I picked up my phone and dialed the bank before I could talk myself out of it. When the woman on the line told me the total fee, $25.70 per year, 35 years unpaid, roughly $900, I laughed. Not because it was funny, because I had exactly $41 in my wallet. I hung up and sat there in silence, the letter shaking in my hands. If Richard was telling the truth, the box would be empty, worthless, a dead end. But if he wasn't, then whatever was inside had been hidden from me on purpose. And for the first time since losing my job, I felt something stir beneath the fear and exhaustion. Not hope. Suspicion. The next morning, I counted my money 3 times, like the number might change if I stared at it hard enough. $41. That was everything I had to my name. I sat at my small kitchen table, the bank letter spread out in front of me, doing the math over and over. $25.70 a year, 35 years, just under $900. It wasn't a fortune. It wasn't even close. But it might as well have been $9 million. I called the bank again, hoping I'd misunderstood something the first time. There isn't a payment plan? I asked. Or anything like that? I'm sorry, Miss Harris, the representative replied politely. The full balance must be paid before the box can be accessed. Of course it did. I hung up and stared at the wall, my thoughts racing. I could ask my friends, but most of them were barely getting by themselves. My mom had passed years ago. Richard was out of the question. For a brief, humiliating moment, I even opened a payday loan website. The interest rates made my stomach turn. Borrowing money to maybe discover nothing inside a box felt reckless, desperate, and I was desperate but not careless. By that afternoon, I had made a decision. If that box was the only thing my grandfather ever left with my name on it, then I wasn't letting it disappear without trying. I started selling what little I had left. I listed my old camera online first. It sold within hours for a fraction of what it was worth. Then my bookshelf. Then the small dining table I'd eaten at since college. Each item leaving felt like erasing another piece of my life, but I kept telling myself it was temporary. I picked up a few short-term gigs organizing files, cleaning apartments, walking dogs for neighbors who barely looked at me when they handed over the keys. I worked until my back ached and my hands were sore. At night, I added the numbers on a scrap of paper. $60, $120, $275. It still wasn't enough. 2 days later, exhausted and frustrated, I stood outside the bank anyway. I don't know what I expected. Mercy, maybe, or a miracle, but my legs carried me there before my brain could stop them. The lobby was quiet, cool, almost intimidating. I approached the front desk and explained my situation again, my voice low. "I know I'm short," I said. "But if there's any way, any documentation I can sign, any extension." The woman listened without interrupting. Her nameplate read Linda Parker. She didn't rush me. She didn't look at her watch. She just nodded slowly, as if she was piecing something together. "Let me pull up the file," she said. As she typed, I felt my chest tighten. This was it. One yes or no between me and whatever my grandfather had hidden away. She paused, frowned slightly, then clicked through another screen. "This box hasn't been accessed since it was opened," she murmured. "That's unusual." My heart skipped. She leaned back in her chair and studied me for a moment. "You said your uncle handled the estate?" "Yes," I replied. "He told me there was nothing else." Linda's expression changed. Not dramatically, just enough. "I can't promise anything," she said carefully. "But I'd like to look a little deeper." She stood and motioned for me to follow her. As we walked toward a side office, my hands started to shake. For the first time since I'd opened that letter, it felt like I was standing at the edge of something Richard had hoped I'd never find. Linda led me down a quiet hallway and into a small office tucked away from the main lobby. The door closed softly behind us, muting the sound of ringing phones and polite conversations. It felt like stepping out of the present and into something suspended in time. "I'm going to the vault," she said. "I'll give you privacy once we open it." My mouth was dry. I could only nod. The vault door was massive, cold metal polished to a dull shine. When it opened, the sound echoed deep and final, like something sealing behind me. Rows of small metal boxes lined the walls, each one holding someone's past, someone's secrets. Linda located the box quickly. She checked the numbers twice, then handed it to me. "I'll be right outside," she said gently. The room felt suddenly very small. I set the box on the table and just stared at it for a moment. This was it. 35 years of silence. 35 years of being told there was nothing. My hands trembled as I opened the lid. On top lay a thick stack of yellowed documents, carefully arranged. Beneath them was something I didn't recognize. At first, a single certificate, its edges worn but intact. I picked it up. Apple Computer Incorporated. The date stopped me cold. Early 1000, 990 seconds. My heart began pounding so loudly I was sure someone outside could hear it. I didn't know much about stocks, but I knew enough to understand that Apple shares bought that long ago weren't small. They weren't symbolic. They were life-changing. I set the certificate down carefully, like it might shatter, and reached deeper into the box. That's when I saw the envelope. It was sealed, thick paper. My grandfather's handwriting, unmistakable even after all these years. To my granddaughter, Chloe. My knees gave out. I slid down into the chair, clutching the envelope to my chest as if it were the only thing keeping me upright. He knew. He had known there would come a day when someone would tell me I didn't matter, when my name would be erased. And he had written this anyway for me. I broke the seal with shaking fingers. The first line was simple. "My girl, if you're reading this, it means someone failed you." The words blurred as tears filled my eyes. I covered my mouth, trying to steady my breathing, but the weight of it all came crashing down at once. The loss, the lies, the years of quiet dismissal. He had left me something, not out of obligation, not as an afterthought, on purpose. As I turned the page, I realized this letter wasn't just an inheritance. It was a confession, and whatever it revealed was something my uncle had never wanted me to see. I read the letter slowly, afraid that if I rushed, the words might disappear. My grandfather's handwriting wavered in places, but his meaning was clear, painfully clear. I didn't plan to leave you out, he wrote. And if anyone tells you otherwise, they are lying to protect themselves. My chest tightened. He explained that in the last year of his life, when his health declined, he had relied heavily on Richard. Trusted him. Let him handle the paperwork. Documents were brought to him late in the evenings, framed as routine updates, legal necessities, things that needed to be signed quickly. I was tired, medicated. I believed my son would never use that against me. The words felt heavy in my hands. He described moments of clarity brief, sharp windows where he realized something was wrong, accounts he didn't recognize, transfers he didn't remember approving, questions that were brushed aside with reassurances. By the time I understood what had happened, he wrote, it was already too late to fix it openly. I swallowed hard, my throat burning. Then the letter shifted. So I did what I could quietly. He wrote about the Apple stock, how he bought it outside the company, how he never mentioned it to anyone, not even his lawyers tied to the business. It was meant to be separate, untouchable. I wanted something that could not be taken from you. At the bottom of the page, my hands started shaking again. There is a recorded statement, dated and witnessed. It explains everything, what was signed, how, and why it never reflected my true wishes. He named the attorney, James Caldwell. He named the file. If you are reading this, Chloe, it means you are strong enough to look for the truth. Use it carefully. Truth doesn't need anger to win, but it does need courage. Tears slipped down my face, silent and unstoppable. This wasn't about money anymore. This was proof. Proof that my grandfather hadn't forgotten me. Proof that I hadn't imagined the warmth in his voice, the way he held me like I mattered. And proof that someone had worked very hard to make sure I never found this box. I folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope, my hands steadier now. For the first time since Richard looked me in the eye and told me I didn't exist, I felt something solid take root inside my chest. Not hope, certainty. Whatever came next, lawyers, confrontation, consequences, I wasn't walking into it blind anymore. I wasn't just his niece who'd been overlooked. I was the granddaughter he'd trusted with the truth, and I was ready to use it. I didn't call Richard right away. For once, I didn't rush. I didn't panic. I sat in the small viewing room of the bank, the letter folded neatly in my bag, the Apple stock certificate resting on the table like a quiet witness. My grandfather had waited 35 years for this moment. I could wait one more day to do it right. The next morning, I called James Caldwell's office. When I gave my name, there was a pause on the line long enough for doubt to creep back in. Then his assistant said softly, "Please hold. Mr. Caldwell will take this call himself." That was the first crack. When we met later that afternoon, James Caldwell didn't offer small talk. He closed the door, sat across from me, and stared at the letter for a long moment before he spoke. "I wondered when you'd find it," he said quietly. My heart slammed against my ribs. "You knew?" "I knew there was a chance," he replied. "Your grandfather was very careful in the end." He reached into a locked cabinet and removed a thin red folder. "File H-19, he said. "Your grandfather recorded a sworn statement. He was clear, calm, fully aware." My hands curled into fists. "Clear about what?" Caldwell met my eyes. That he was pressured. That documents were presented under misleading circumstances. That his final will did not reflect his true intent. The room felt suddenly too warm. "And Richard?" I asked. Caldwell exhaled. "Your uncle was very convincing. And very thorough." I nodded slowly. Then it's time he heard something convincing too. Richard didn't expect me to walk into his office. He looked up from his desk, irritation flashing across his face before surprise replaced it. "Chloe," he said, "this isn't appropriate." I closed the door behind me. Neither was lying to me. His jaw tightened. "I told you everything that mattered." I placed the copy of the Apple stock certificate on his desk. The color drained from his face. "What's this supposed to be?" he asked, though his voice had already lost its confidence. "My grandfather bought it in 1990, I said evenly. "Outside the company. Outside your control. Richard stood up slowly. You have no idea what you're talking about. I pulled the letter from my bag next. This is addressed to me, I said, in his handwriting. Richard didn't touch it. He stared at it like it might explode. You don't want to do this, he said finally. You don't understand how much damage this could cause. I let out a short, humorless laugh. You mean to you? His voice sharpened. You think one letter changes decades of legal work? No, I replied. But the recording might. Silence fell between us, thick and heavy. What recording? He asked. The one where he explains how you brought papers late at night, I said. When he was medicated. When he trusted you. Richard's composure cracked. That's absurd, he snapped. There's no proof. There is, I said. And it's dated, witnessed, filed. For the first time since I'd known him, Richard looked scared. You're making a mistake, he said quietly. This doesn't end well for anyone. I leaned forward. It already ended badly. I'm just telling the truth now. The mediation happened 2 weeks later. No shouting, no dramatics, just a long table, stacks of documents, and a recording played once, then twice. My grandfather's voice filled the room. Calm. Certain. I did not intend to disinherit my granddaughter, he said in the recording. Any document suggesting otherwise was signed under misunderstanding and undue influence. Richard stared at the table. His lawyers whispered urgently. Papers shuffled. The air shifted. This wasn't about emotion anymore. This was about evidence. By the end of the session, Richard's attorneys asked for a recess. By the end of the day, they asked for a settlement. Not because they were kind, because they were cornered. As I left the building, the weight I'd been carrying for years finally began to lift, not all at once, but enough for me to breathe. Richard didn't look at me when we passed in the hallway. For the first time, I didn't need him to, because the truth had spoken. And it had been louder than him. The settlement talks didn't end the story. They cracked it open. Once Richard's lawyers realized the recording was airtight, dated, witnessed, and supported by medical records, they stopped arguing about whether wrongdoing had happened and started negotiating how much damage could be contained. That was when I learned the full scale of the lie. Over the next several days, documents surfaced that had never been shown to me before. Valuations, sale agreements, offshore holding structures. The company my grandfather built with a single truck hadn't just grown, it had been quietly repositioned, packaged, and sold in pieces over decades. The final number landed like a physical blow, $690 million. That was the amount Richard had personally cleared through asset transfers, stock sales, and investment vehicles tied directly to the will he claimed was clean. Clean. James Caldwell slid the summary across the table to me. This is what your grandfather was afraid of, he said. Not just that you'd be cut out, but that the truth would be buried under complexity. I felt sick. Not because of the money. Because of the years. Years where my mother struggled. Years where I worked myself to exhaustion, believing I simply hadn't been wanted enough. Years where Richard sent polite holiday emails signed family first, knowing exactly what he'd done. When the second mediation session began, the room felt different. Richard wasn't confident anymore. He looked smaller somehow, older. His lawyers spoke for him now, carefully choosing words like misinterpretation, administrative oversight, unintended consequence. I listened without interrupting. Finally, the lead mediator turned to me. Miss Harris, do you wish to respond? I stood. I don't want revenge, I said calmly. I want the record corrected. Richard looked up sharply. My grandfather didn't forget me, I continued. He was misled, and that lie allowed nearly $700 million to change hands under false pretenses. The room went silent. I won't be erased quietly, I said, and I won't sign anything that pretends this was an accident. Richard's attorney leaned toward him, whispering urgently. Richard shook his head at first, then stopped. Something in him broke. This will destroy my reputation, he said suddenly, his voice strained. Do you know what you're asking? I met his eyes. No, I said. I know what you took. That was the moment. The negotiations shifted completely. By the end of the week, The agreement included not just compensation, but formal legal acknowledgement of undue influence, amendments to public records, revisions to corporate filings, disclosures that could not be quietly sealed. Richard kept most of his wealth, but the lie didn't survive. Financial publications began asking questions, then auditors, then regulators. The story unraveled not explosively, but relentlessly, and every thread led back to one truth. I had never been forgotten. I had been deliberately excluded. When I walked out of the final meeting, the city felt louder, brighter. I stopped on the courthouse steps and let the air fill my lungs. For the first time in my adult life, I wasn't carrying someone else's version of my worth. The lie that built a $690 million empire was collapsing, and I didn't have to push. All I did was refuse to disappear. When everything was finalized, people expected me to celebrate. Friends asked if I was going to finally live large. Strangers, once the story leaked, assumed I'd walked away with some dramatic fortune, that my life had flipped overnight from struggle to luxury. It hadn't. What I gained wasn't sudden wealth. It was something quieter, heavier, truer. I received a structured settlement, carefully designed through the court to restore what should never have been taken and to protect me from becoming another headline. Most of the Apple stock was placed into a trust. I kept one original share certificate, framed on the wall of my new apartment, not because of what it's worth, because of what it represents. I used part of the money to pay off my debts. No more overdue notices, no more calculating groceries in my head. I went back to school part-time, something I'd always postponed because survival came first. I also set up a small legal fund in my grandfather's name for people who were told, like I was, that they didn't matter because paperwork said so. James Caldwell told me once, quietly, "Your grandfather didn't just plan for justice, he planned for you." I think about that often. Richard never apologized. He didn't need to. The truth followed him everywhere after that, into boardrooms, into interviews, into every conversation where his name came up with a pause afterward. As for me, I stopped flinching when people talked about family, about inheritance, about legacy, because I finally understood mine. My grandfather didn't leave me millions to spend. He left me proof. Proof that love can be patient. That truth can wait decades and still arrive intact. And that even when the world tells you that you were never mentioned, never chosen, never counted, someone, somewhere, remembered your name. And sometimes, that is worth more than $690 million.